March 8th, 1942. Richmond, California. Under floodlights and foghorns, a shipyard roars like a battlefield. Above the slipway hangs a giant clock, its second hand snapping forward like a command. Faster. Evelyn Calder, young, stubborn, and newly trained as a welder, steps into a world where steel arrives in giant blocks, seams are stitched with fire, and every mistake could drown men she'll never meet. The newspapers scream of U-boats and burning freighters. Washington screams for tonnage, and Kaiser's yard answers with a terrifying promise: build ships quicker than the enemy can sink them. But when rumours spread of Liberty hulls cracking, Ev learns the clock isn't just measuring time, it's testing lives. And tonight, the arc light flares, and the race begins. The clock over the ways. March 8th, 1942, Richmond, California. The night air tastes like salt and hot metal, and the shipyard is loud enough to drown out thought. A foghorn moans somewhere out on the bay, low and patient, while inside the fence the world is all hammering, sparks, and the white glare of arc lights. Overhead, a crane swings like a slow black pendulum. It carries a steel section, boxed ribs and plate, suspended on cables that hum when the wind catches them. The load drifts above the men and women below, above the scattered tool carts, above the chalked lines on the ground that tell you where a piece of ship is supposed to land. And above all of it, bolted to a timber frame beside the slipway, there's the clock. It isn't the kind you hang in a kitchen. It's a yard clock. Big numerals, big hands, big enough that you can read it through steam and smoke. It faces the ways like an accusation. The second hand snaps forward with a hard little twitch, like a foreman's finger tapping a clipboard. Evelyn Calder. Ev, to everyone who can shout her name over the din, tilts her head back to look at it through the flip-down lens of her welding hood. The glass smells faintly of sweat and soot. She hasn't been on the job long enough to stop noticing how the yard watches time. She's 23, hair pinned tight under a scarf, coveralls too big in the shoulders because they're government issue and the war doesn't tailor anything for you. Her gloves are stiff with old slag. The burn marks on her sleeves look like freckles made of ash. Ev stands near the edge of the berth where the ship is taking shape. Not a ship yet, not really. More like the skeleton of one, ribs rising out of the blocks. On paper, it has a designation and a number. Around here, it has a nickname, a Liberty. She'd heard the word before, back in Oakland, in the line outside the employment office where the poster of a woman in a red bandana promised there was work for anyone with hands and backbone. Liberty ships, the recruiter had said, like it was a prayer or a dare. Emergency cargo. We're building them fast. Fast. That's the word that follows Ev through the gate every night. Calder. The voice comes from below the clock, from a man with a white hard hat and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Frank Madsen. A foreman with the posture of someone who's been bracing for bad news since December. He has a pencil clamped between his teeth and a face so wine-burned it looks carved. He jabs a thumb toward the steel section coming in. See that block? You're on the seam once they set it. Keep your bead clean. Inspector's walking. Got it, Eve calls back. The words come out small in the noise. Frank's eyes flick, not to her, but to the clock. Always the clock, like it's another supervisor who never sleeps. Eve's station is a temporary platform welded to a rib. She climbs, boots ringing on metal, and the ship answers with a hollow drum skin resonance. Up close, the steel smells different, cold and oily at the edges, warm where the torches have kissed it. She sets her toolbox down, checks the stinger lead, checks the ground clamp like she was taught, because the yard has no patience for mistakes that stop the line. Below, men guide the swinging block with taglines, shouting the way sailors do when a deck is wet and a wave is coming. Someone blows a whistle, short, sharp bursts. The crane operator responds with a slow, obedient lift and a gentle drop. The block settles into place with a heavy final thunk. The sound runs through the ship's bones and into Eve's knees. For a moment, the yard holds its breath. Then the work floods back in. Hammers, grinders, the rattle of pneumatic tools. Ev lowers her hood and strikes an arc. The first bright flare blooms at the seam like a sudden sunrise. The weld puddle forms, molten and obedient, and she moves the electrode with careful rhythm, drag, pause, drag, watching the edges tie in. The slag curls and hardens behind her bead. She smells ozone and burned flux, a sharp, clean sting that lives in the back of the throat. This isn't the job she thought she'd do. She'd come in hearing the old word, riveter, and imagining the staccato music of riveting guns and bucking bars, the kind of work the yard used to do when ships were built like cathedrals. But the Kaiser yards talk about welding like it's a revolution. Rivets are slow. Rivets are yesterday. Welding is speed. Welding is the war. They're building ships the way Detroit builds cars, Frank told them in orientation. He'd said it like a warning, like a promise. Ev remembers the briefing board in the canteen, where someone had pinned a clipping about tankers burning off the east coast, the sea lit orange at night. She remembers the way the older men read it with their jaws clenched, as if the paper itself could be blamed. German submarines, someone had muttered. They're hunting right off our beaches. Ev doesn't know the ocean like a sailor does, but she understands arithmetic. If ships are going down faster than you can replace them, you lose without ever seeing the enemy. That's what the clock is for. Not to tell time, to measure it, to weaponize it. Her bead reaches the end of the seam. She chips slag with the edge of a hammer, the brittle crust breaking away to reveal the dark, solid line beneath. It isn't pretty, but it holds. And in this yard, holding is what matters. Frank climbs up behind her, boots clanging, and squats to inspect. He runs a gloved finger along the weld, then looks out toward the ways, toward the half-built ship and the crews moving in disciplined swarms. "You hear the radio?" he asks, voice low now, as if the ship might overhear. Ev shakes her head. "Another one lost," Frank says. "Cargo ship, somewhere out there." He nods west, not because the Atlantic is west, but because in this yard the whole world is beyond the fence. They're screaming for tonnage. Washington's screaming. Maritime Commission's screaming. So he lifts his chin toward the big clock. The second hand snaps forward again. We scream back. Ev swallows. Under her hood, her face is damp. She looks down at the steel and tries to imagine it finished, hull-plated, deck-laid, hatches fitted, a name painted on the bow, a wake boiling behind it. A ship that isn't built for glory, just for carrying. Food, fuel, ammunition, trucks, anything the war can't breathe without. Below them, a new crew is already moving in, fitting another piece, marking another seam. The yard doesn't pause to admire what's been done. The clock doesn't either. Ev sets a fresh rod in the stinger. She strikes another arc. The seam blooms white again, and for a moment the entire shipyard is lit like a battlefield, except here the enemy is time, and the weapon is a line of molten steel laid down by a woman who used to think the war was something happening far away. The second hand ticks, and the ship keeps growing. Spring 1942. Build it like a bridge. The arc light dies with a soft hiss when Ev lifts her hood, and darkness rushes back in around the bright islands of work. The yard never truly goes dark. Too many lamps, too many torches, too much urgency. But the moments between welds feel like stepping out of sunlight into a tunnel. A runner clambers up to the platform and shoves a clipboard toward Frank. The paper flaps in the wind off the bay. Frank signs without reading, because what matters isn't the words. What matters is the box that gets checked, the piece that gets cleared, the seam that stops being a problem. Ev wipes her glove on her coveralls and climbs down. Her shoulders ache with a dull, honest pain. She's learning to measure her body the way the yard measures steel, by how much it can give before it fails. At the foot of the ways, the clock stares back. A chalkboard beside it lists hull numbers and dates in fat white strokes, a running tally like a scoreboard. Some of the women call it the brag board, some call it the shame board. It depends on the day. "Calder," Frank says, walking her toward the staging area. "You're in the welding school again tomorrow. Afternoon. Don't miss it." "I'm already welding," she says, because she can't help it. She gestures back at the seam she just laid. Frank gives her a look that says, "Kid, you don't know what you don't know. You're welding in a shipyard that's trying to teach itself to run like a factory," he says. "Different animal. They'll show you the jigs, the sequences, how to keep the line moving without cutting corners." Ev looks out across the yard. The place is a city made of temporary things, scaffolds, wooden forms, stacks of plate, piles of angle iron, crates of electrodes. Everywhere paint marks and chalk lines tell workers where steel should go, like the yard has drawn its own maps on everything it touches. And there beyond the ways are the assembly areas, flat expanses where hull panels are built like giant quilts. Men and women fit stiffeners onto plates, tack them down, and run long, straight beads. A crane lifts the finished panel and carries it away, swinging over heads like a heavy promise. Ev had thought ships were built from the keel up, like a story you tell in order. But the yard doesn't tell stories. It stacks chapters. In the training shack the next afternoon, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and burnt coffee. A chalkboard at the front reads, "Weld fast, weld right, weld safe." Underneath it, someone has scrawled in a different hand, "The ocean doesn't forgive." The instructor is a compact older man with a Maritime Commission badge pinned to his coveralls like a small shield. He speaks without wasting words. On the table in front of him are cutaway samples, welded joints, fillets, butt seams. Some look clean and strong. Others are disasters, porosity like sponge, undercut grooves that would become cracks, slag trapped where it has no business living. He points to the bad one. "This is what happens when you chase the clock and forget the ship," he says. His voice is flat, which makes it worse. "You want to go fast? Fine, but you go fast the right way." He gestures toward a diagram, an outline of a cargo ship with compartments labelled, bulkheads marked like ribs in a chest. The name is written in block letters, EC2SC1. The designation means nothing to Eve yet, but the instructor treats it like scripture. Standard design, he says. Same frames, same bulkheads, same hatch combings, same everything, so the yard can build it with repeatable steps. No guessing, no reinventing. We don't have time for artistry. He wraps the chalkboard where sequence is underlined twice. You don't weld wherever you feel like. You weld in order so the steel doesn't pull itself out of shape. You stagger, you balance heat, you let the ship breathe. Ev watches the demonstration. The instructor tacks a piece, runs a short bead, then flips the work and runs another on the opposite side. It's like watching someone stitch cloth, except the thread is fire. At her station, Ev tries to imitate him. She angles the electrode. She listens to the sound, steady crackle, not sputter. She learns that the weld talks to you if you stop trying to bully it. When her bead comes out too convex, the instructor taps it with his chipping hammer. "Too cold," he says, "or you're rushing. Either way, you're making a future problem." On break, she stands outside with a woman named Marisol, who has grease on her cheeks and a laugh that cuts through fatigue. Marisol nods toward the open yard where a row of fabricated sections sits on wooden blocks, each marked with white paint. Bow, mid-body, stern. "You ever see anything like this before?" Marisol asks. Ev shakes her head. "They call 'em blocks," Marisol says. "Like we're building with toy bricks. I saw a guy from back east, old riveter, nearly spit his lunch when he realised we're lifting whole chunks into place." Ev watches a crane inch forward, cables taut, lifting a section that looks like the corner of a building. Men guide it with taglines. A whistle shrieks. The block swings and lowers with a patience the yard rarely has for people. "It's like a bridge," Ev says before she can stop herself. Marisol grins. "That's what my cousin said. He worked on the Bay Bridge. Says this yard stole every trick from civil construction and dressed it up in a sailor suit." Inside, the instructor calls them back. The training continues, and with it comes a new kind of pressure, not the loud pressure of the ways, but the quiet pressure of standards. Inspectors walk the yard with flashlights and mirrors, peering into seams. They carry gauges and notebooks, and the authority to make you grind out a bead and do it again. No one cheers when they show up, but everyone watches them like sailors watch weather. That night, back on the ship, Ev feels the difference. The work isn't just doing, it's placing each weld into a sequence that someone has planned down to the minute. Pieces arrive from the panel line already fitted, already marked. The ship is no longer a mystery of steel. It's a schedule, and the schedule has a heartbeat. Ev pauses to adjust her hood and catches the clock again out of the corner of her eye. The second hand snaps forward. Somewhere far away, a freighter burns on a black ocean. Somewhere closer, a convoy forms up and prays for escort. Here, under the arc lights, you can almost believe time is something you can weld into obedience. Ev strikes the arc. The seam blooms white. The shipyard surges on, a launch every few days. July 14th, 1942, Richmond, California. The yard wakes before the sun does. By the time Ev walks through the gate, the sky over the bay is the colour of dirty pewter, and the air already carries that shipyard of salt, diesel and scorched flux. A siren blares, one long note that tells everyone the same thing. Launch day. You can always feel it in the way people move. Faster, but careful. Like a church aisle before a wedding, except the bride weighs 14,000 tons and the aisle is a greased track aimed straight at the water. Ev threads her way through clusters of workers, dodging hoses and stacks of timber, and stops where the slipway opens up like a stage. The ship stands there finished, at least finished enough to take the sea. Grey hull plates, the sharp knuckle of the bow, the long run of the deck with hatches like square mouths. On the bow, fresh paint spells out a name she's seen only on paper until now. It looks impossible that something this big can be new, like it should have always existed. Frank finds her before she can drift too far into staring. Calder, he says, and she hears the strain beneath his usual bark. Launch days do that to foremen, make them superstitious. You know where your seam is? Ev nods. She knows exactly. A run along a mid-body plate low enough that once the ship meets the bay, it will vanish beneath the waterline like it never happened. Good, Frank says. Then you get to join the rest of us praying. There are inspectors on the ways with clipboards checking wedges and triggers. The ship rests on its cradle, and beneath it the wooden ways have been slathered with tallow and soap, an old trick made brutal by necessity. Men with push brooms smooth the grease into shining lanes. The whole slope looks slick enough to slide a house. Ev spots Marisol in the crowd, hair tucked up under her scarf, face scrubbed clean for once. Marisol waves her over. You think she'll go? Marisol asks, half joking, half not. Ev swallows. That's the thing about welding. When it's done right, nobody notices it. When it's wrong, the ocean notices first. She'll go, Ev says, and tries to make it a fact. Up near the bow, a small platform has been erected, draped with bunting that flutters like nervous flags. Men in suits and hats stand beside Navy officers in dark uniforms. Someone's brought a band, brass instruments catching what little light there is. A photographer crouches low, waiting like a hunter. The yard clock is visible even from here, looming at the edge of the slip. On launch days, it feels like the whole yard is looking at the clock and the ship at the same time, as if they're measuring which one will blink first. A loudspeaker crackles, then clears. To the United States Maritime Commission, to the workers of Richmond, and to the men who will carry these cargoes across the world. The words ride over the crowd, formal and proud. Ev barely hears them. Her ears are tuned to other sounds, the thrum of a tugboat idling in the water below, ready to catch the hull, the clack of a hammer as someone taps a last wedge into place, the dry squeak of rope under tension. Look, Marisol murmurs. A line of sailors in navy blue appears along the quay, young men, duffels slung over shoulders. Not shipyard men, not merchant mariners either. Their caps sit just so. Their posture is different, too straight, like the war has already begun, drilling them into shape. Armed guard, Frank says behind them, as if he's been reading their thoughts. They're riding our ships now. Ev has heard rumours, merchant ships getting Navy gun crews. She's heard talk about submarines, about torpedoes that hit so hard they lift a ship out of the water. But seeing the sailors makes it real in a way newspaper clippings never did. One of the sailors looks up at the ship as if trying to memorize it. He can't be much older than Ev. His face is pale in the morning light, and he has a soft farm boy jaw under the regulation seriousness. He catches Ev watching and nods quick and shy like they've just been introduced at a dance. Marisol elbows Ev. You going to wave back or just stare? Ev lifts her hand, awkward in her gloves. The sailor nods again and keeps walking with his line, boots scuffing on the planks. Above, the sponsor steps forward with a bottle cradled in both hands. The crowd hushes in that strange way, thousands of people quieting not because they're told to, but because they want to hear the moment. The loudspeaker booms the name again. The sponsor swings. Glass shatters against the bow with a sharp, satisfying crack. Cheers erupt like steam. The band stumbles into something patriotic. Ev feels the sound in her ribs. Then comes the part that makes her stomach tighten. A whistle shrieks, 2 blasts, then 1. Men move to the triggers. The release mechanism, simple, brutal, reliable, waits like a loaded spring. For a split second, nothing happens. And then the ship moves. At first it's barely a shudder, a reluctant inch. The cradle creaks, the greased ways take hold. The hull begins to slide, slow as a continent shifting. The crowd roars. Some people shout the ship's name. Some just shout. Marisol grabs Ev's sleeve so hard it hurts. Ev can't look away. The hull gathers speed, and suddenly it's not slow at all. It's a grey wall moving downhill, unstoppable. You feel it in your teeth. You feel it in your bones. Every weld, every plate, every decision made under that clock is being tested by gravity and momentum. The bow hits the water with a deep, thunderous slap that sends spray up in a white fan. The bay swallows the hull in a rush of foam. Tugs surge forward, horns blaring, pushing their shoulders against the ship to keep it from swinging too far. For a heartbeat, the ship rides high and clean, new paint shining wet. Then the waterline climbs and steadies, and she floats, alive. Ev exhales so hard she tastes metal. Frank's hand lands on her shoulder, heavy and brief. "That's one," he says, not triumphant, just grimly satisfied. "Now we start the next." Ev looks back up the ways. Already, beyond the wet tracks and the celebrating crowd, men are hauling timber, resetting blocks, laying keel pieces for another hull. The scoreboard will change. The clock will keep snapping forward. The yard will swallow this moment and demand another. Down by the quay, the armed guard sailors watch the floating ship with a different kind of silence. The farm boy sailor Ev noticed earlier stands with his hands on his duffel straps, eyes fixed on the stern like he can already see the gun that will be mounted there. Ev realizes, with a sudden clarity that feels like cold water on the face, that they aren't just launching ships, they're launching chances. A ship to replace one that burned. A hull to carry food that keeps someone else from starving. Steel and sweat turned into distance, distance between the enemy and the things the enemy wants to stop. The tug horns bellow again. The ship answers with a deep groan of metal settling into its new life. And up on the slipway, the empty cradle waits to be greased for the next one. The record run. November 8th, 1942, 12:01 a.m., Richmond, California. The yard is awake in a way that feels unnatural, like someone flipped a switch inside the night. Floodlights bleach the slipways into harsh daylight. Steam rolls off coffee urns. The wind off San Francisco Bay cuts through coveralls and makes the cranes groan on their rails. Over by the gate, a portable radio barks clipped voices, news that American troops are going ashore in North Africa, a name repeated over static. Torch. Men pause just long enough to hear it, then keep walking, because here the war arrives as schedules and steel. On Slipway 2, the clock has company. A row of men in clean coats stands near the base of the ways, clipboards held like shields. One of them carries a stopwatch on a lanyard. Another has a stiff maritime commission badge. Frank calls them the visitors, but his mouth twists like he means something else. The witnesses. Eve finds her crew at the staging area, where stacks of prefabricated sections sit like giant puzzle pieces waiting for hands to make them one thing. Someone has painted big white numbers on the steel. Chalk arrows point to match marks. Every plate edge is beveled, every stiffener tagged. It looks less like shipbuilding than like a factory floor that accidentally grew a horizon. Frank looks worse than usual, eyes red, jaw tight, cigarette already burning. "You're on mid-body," he tells Ev, voice low and fast. "Block seam, starboard side. They want no grinding delays. You lay it right the first time." Ev glances toward the slip. A small ceremony has been arranged, keel-laying, the officials call it. It feels strange, theatrical, because Eve has watched pieces of this ship's body sitting ready for days. The keel is a milestone, not a beginning. The beginning happened in the fabricating shops, in the panel lines, in the yards where sections were built out of sight and time. But tonight the yard wants a moment you can film. "Why now?" Marisol murmurs beside Ev, eyes flicking between the stopwatch men and the clock. "You know why," someone answers. "Kaiser wants the world to see." Ev doesn't say anything. She can already feel it, the way the yard has tightened. Extra men assigned to every crew. More cranes than usual. Runners posted like messengers in an army. Even the inspectors look different. Less like quiet judges and more like nervous chaperones. Nobody wants to be the weld that slows the story down. A whistle shrieks. The ceremony begins. A man with a practiced voice says something about production, about democracy, about how ships are weapons when they carry what armies need. Ev catches only pieces. The important sound is the one that follows. The first steel set into place on the ways, settled with a deep final thud that carries through the ground. A stopwatch clicks. "Go," Frank says, and the yard turns into a machine. Crane hooks drop, taglines snap taut. A block lifts, swings, lowers into the waiting cradle with inches to spare. Men in hard hats guide it with gloved hands, shouting numbers and angles. Fitters slam wedges into place. Tack welders jump in, their arcs flashing like lightning. The noise doesn't build. It arrives all at once, a wall of sound that stays. Ev climbs her platform and starts. Her world narrows to seam and puddle, to the angle of the rod and the speed of her travel. She hears the weld more than she sees it, the steady sizzle that means she's hot enough, the sudden change in pitch that warns of a gap, a bad fit, a spot that could hide trouble. Behind her hood the light is brutal white, and beyond it the yard is all moving shapes and steam. A runner appears, waving a paper. Frank snatches it, signs, shoves it back. The runner vanishes. Another block swings in. "Keep it moving," someone yells, but it isn't a threat. It's a prayer. Hours blur. The shift bell rings and nobody leaves. Instead, bodies trade places like parts on a line. Fresh welders stepping up, tired ones stepping down, coffee shoved into hands, a sandwich pressed against a chest before someone is pushed back toward the seam. The yard has been running around the clock for months, but this is different. This is staged urgency, choreographed speed. At dawn, newsreel cameras arrive. Ev sees them only in flashes. Men in caps carrying heavy cases, a tripod set up near the clock, a bright light pointed at the slip like the ship is an actor. A photographer climbs a scaffold for a better angle. Officials in suits move carefully through the chaos, escorted by foremen who look like they'd rather be anywhere else. Marisol appears beside Ev for a moment, sweat streaking her temples. "You hear it?" she asks, half laughing, half panting. "Hear what?" Marisol jerks her chin toward the ways. "They're calling it a miracle." Ev wants to laugh too, because she knows what the miracle is made of. It's made of women with burned sleeves and men who haven't slept, of jigs and match marks, of plates cut to the same pattern so you don't waste minutes thinking. It's made of 1,000 decisions about where to put the work so that when the clock starts, the pieces can fly. But there's also something else in it, something that sits heavy behind her ribs. Because while cameras roll and stopwatches click, the ocean is still out there, and it doesn't care about publicity. By the second day, Ev's hands cramp when she releases the stinger. Her shoulders feel like rope rubbed raw. She catches herself staring at the clock between welds, as if her gaze could slow it down or speed it up depending on what the ship needs. On the third night, the yard looks haunted. Arc lights cast hard shadows, steam drifts through the ribs of the hull like fog through a ruined building. Men move with the stiff precision of exhaustion. Somewhere, someone starts singing under their breath, just a few lines, then stops, as if sound is a luxury. Frank finds Ev at a water barrel, washing slag dust off her gloves. "Inspector wants to see your seam," he says. Her stomach tightens. "Something wrong?" Frank shakes his head, but his eyes flick to the stopwatch man, who is watching the ship like a hawk watches a mouse. "Nothing's wrong," Frank says. "They just want to say they saw it. Everyone wants their fingerprints on this." Ev follows him back to the seam. The inspector, a thin man with a flashlight and a mirror on a stick, leans in, checks the bead, checks the tie-in, checks the heat marks. He looks up at her. In the harsh light, his face is grey with fatigue. "Good," he says, and it isn't praise, it's relief. "Keep it that way." By the morning of the fourth day, the ship stands whole enough to fool the eye. Grey hull, deck, hatches, a name freshly painted on the bow in bold letters big enough for a camera to love. Robert E. Peary. Ev stands with the crowd again, but this time the cheering feels strained, as if everyone knows they're part of an experiment. Officials climb the platform. Cameras whir. The stopwatch man holds his watch up like a trophy. A whistle blasts. The ship slides down the greased ways and hits the water with a roar that shakes the air. Spray rises. Tug horns answer. The crowd erupts because people need something to erupt for. Ev cheers too, because she helped make it, because she can't not. But as the hull settles into the bay, she notices something that doesn't make it into the speeches. Workboats swarm the ship immediately. Men climb aboard with tools and lists and fittings. The launch was the finish line for the cameras, not for the ship. There's still so much to do, still a war's worth of details to bolt down. Marisol leans close, voice rough. 4 days, she whispers like it's a spell. Ev watches the ship float, brand new and already unfinished, and she understands what Kaiser has really built. Not just a ship. A message, aimed across an ocean. We can replace what you sink. We can do it faster than you think. Up on the ways, the clock snaps forward again, indifferent to applause. And Frank, eyes on the empty cradle already being cleared, says what he always says, like a curse and a command. Now we build the next one. Cracks and Consequences, January 17th, 1943, Richmond, California. The rain comes in sideways off the bay, cold enough to sting exposed skin, warm enough to turn the yard into a slick mirror of mud and light. Ev steps through the gate with her collar up and her lunch pail tucked tight, and the first thing she hears isn't a hammer or a torch. It's laughter, sharp, startled, the kind that shows up when people don't know whether to curse or pray. A cluster of men stands around a portable radio under the eaves of the tool crib. The sound is tinny, half swallowed by static and rain, but the words cut through anyway. Portland, Kaiser Yard, broke clean in two. Ev slows. Her boots slide a little on the wet planks. Someone turns the volume up, and for a moment the voice on the radio is clear enough to make the story land like a dropped wrench. A ship, new, welded, fresh enough to smell like paint, had snapped at the dock in Oregon. Not torpedoed, not shelled, not storm-tossed. Just split. Like a dry stick, one man mutters, eyes wide. Just sitting there. Marisol's elbow bumps Eve's arm. Tell me that's not one of ours. It's Kaiser, another voice answers. Swan Island, Portland. Same company, same hurry. Ev feels a chill that has nothing to do with the rain. She looks past the radio toward the ways, where a Liberty hull looms under floodlights, ribs and plates making a dark geometry against the sky. All those seams, all that speed. Behind her, a riveter, one of the old hands who still calls everyone kid no matter their age, spits into the mud. This is what happens when you build a ship like a tin can, he says. No rivets to stop a crack, just weld and pray. A foreman's whistle cuts the conversation clean in half. Frank's voice follows it, hard and unmistakable. Everybody to the canteen, now. The canteen is packed tight, wet coats steaming, coffee smell mixing with hot metal and damp wool. A few officials stand near the front, engineers, inspectors, men with clean hands that don't belong to the night shift. One of them has a pointer and a roll of drawings under his arm. Another holds a clipboard like it's armour. Frank leans against a post, arms crossed, face set. Ev can tell by the way his jaw works that he's already been shouted at from above. An engineer clears his throat. The room quiets in that uneasy way. Workforce quiet, not audience quiet. People stop talking because they've learned the hard way that the next sentence might change how you do your job. We're not stopping production, the engineer says immediately, as if answering the fear before it can speak. A low murmur runs through the room. But we are changing procedures. He unrolls a drawing and pins it to the board. Even from the back, Ev recognizes the outlines. Deck openings, hatch corners, stiffeners. Places where steel changes direction. Places where the ship's strength has to decide whether to flow smoothly or concentrate into a sharp point. There have been fractures in welded merchant ships, the engineer continues, voice careful. Some severe. The causes aren't a single thing. They're a combination, material, design details, workmanship, temperature. Temperature. Ev feels the word like a draft under a door. One thing we can control here, the engineer says, is workmanship and inspection. Starting tonight, there will be additional checks at critical seams, more grinding out of suspect welds, more emphasis on fit-up. If an inspector tells you to redo it, you redo it. No arguments. Somebody in the crowd calls out, "And the clock." The engineer hesitates. Frank's eyes flick to the yard clock visible through the canteen window, its second hand twitching like an irritated finger. The clock stays, the engineer says, and there's no warmth in it. But you do not sacrifice integrity for speed. A fast ship that fails is not fast, it's dead. Ev looks down at her hands, scarred knuckles, burn marks at the wrist, slag dust that never fully washes out. She thinks of the farm boy sailor she waved to months ago, duffel straps in his fists, eyes fixed on a stern gun that wasn't mounted yet. She thinks of him stepping onto one of these decks in the North Atlantic, where the sea isn't grey and friendly like the bay, but black and hard and indifferent. If a ship can break in half while tied to a pier, what can it do under convoy strain, under waves, under cold? The meeting breaks with no cheers, no speeches, just a collective movement back toward the work, like people returning to a task they suddenly respect in a different way. Outside, the rain has eased, leaving the yard slick and shining. The floodlights turn every puddle into a pale coin. Ev and Marisol head toward their slipway, passing stacks of steel marked in chalk. The marks look like scrawled warnings now. Marisol keeps her voice low. You think they'll slow us down? Ev watches a crew prepping a seam, fitters hammering wedges, a tack welder flashing quick bursts of arc to hold alignment. The ship keeps growing anyway. The yard doesn't know how to do anything but move forward. They'll make us cleaner, Ev says, not slower. On the platform, Ev sets her toolbox down and runs her glove along the edge of a plate. The steel is cold, slick with damp. She can almost feel it wanting to resist, wanting to snap if bullied in the wrong way. Frank climbs up beside her. He doesn't bark this time. His voice is quieter than the rain. You heard the story, he says. Ev nods. Frank points with his chin to the seam ahead, one of the ones the engineer called critical. A long run where plates meet, where strain will travel, where a flaw could become a starting line for disaster. Do it right, Frank says. Then, as if admitting something he hates admitting, I'd rather answer to the clock than to the ocean. Ev lowers her hood. The world narrows to the seam, the rod, the angle of her wrist. She strikes the arc. White light blooms and the shipyard surges back into motion, faster than fear, louder than rumour, yet changed, as if everyone can now hear a hairline sound beneath the noise. Steel reminding you that speed is not the only thing that matters. The second hand on the clock snaps forward, and Ev welds like the ocean is watching. The Conveyor Belt City. March 3rd, 1943. Richmond, California. The yard has learned to run in the rain. Not gracefully, nothing here is graceful, but with the kind of practiced stubbornness you see in men who've spent their lives working outdoors and decided weather is just another tool to be managed. Tarps go up faster, walkways get fresh grit thrown down before anyone slips. Tool rooms issue dry gloves like rations. Welders tuck newspaper under their shirts on cold nights, an old trick dressed up as wartime necessity. Ev crosses the yard before midnight shift, and the place looks less like a construction site than like a living factory stretched across the shoreline. Lights, cranes, stacks of steel, trucks backing up with a hiss of air brakes, railcars unloading plate, loudspeakers calling out hull numbers the way a train station calls departures. Above Slipway 2, the clock is still there, but it no longer feels like a dare. It feels like infrastructure, like the rails, the cranes, the jigs. The yard doesn't ask whether it will keep moving, it asks only how hard. Where the winter rumours had made everyone listen for hidden weakness, the spring has brought something else. Procedure. Not the loose kind you can bend around a foreman's mood, but procedure written down, underlined and posted where you can't pretend you didn't see it. On the board by Ev's station, a new set of instructions sits under glass. Weld sequence diagrams, critical seam lists, notes about fit-up tolerances. Another page mentions crack arresters, steel straps set and fastened across certain seams. A belt and suspenders answer to the idea of a fracture running unchecked. The old riveters point at it like a vindication. The young welders just nod and keep working. The first time Eve sees a crew installing the arresters, she thinks of it like stitching a tear before it can happen. Frank meets her near the mid-body blocks, where enormous sections sit waiting like sleeping animals. He's older in a way Ev can't name. Same body, same bark, but the war has pressed a permanent crease between his brows. You're leading tonight, he says. Ev stops. Leading what? Frank jerks his head toward a platform where 3 welders are already setting up, their leads coiled, their faces half hidden by hoods. Starboard side team. We've got a new pair coming in. Good hands, but green. You keep them in sequence, keep them honest. Eve's first instinct is to refuse. Not because she doesn't want it, but because it feels like stepping into someone else's boots. Boots that come with responsibility that can't be shrugged off at the end of shift. Frank reads it on her face. You've been clean, he says. You've been steady. You listen to inspectors without acting like they insulted your mother. That's what we need. Ev wants to argue that this is still just welding, rod, seam, heat. But she understands what Frank means. The yard has reached the point where the ships are coming so fast that the weakest part isn't steel. It's people who don't yet know the cost of cutting corners. She nods once. Frank slaps her shoulder and moves on, already calling another name, already rearranging the night like chess pieces. Ev climbs up to the platform and meets the new welders. One is a quiet kid from Bakersfield who keeps touching his cap as if it might fall off. The other is a woman older than Ev, hands calloused from fruit packing, eyes sharp with the hard confidence of someone who has raised children through the Depression and refuses to be intimidated by a ship. Ev points to the diagram posted on the stanchion. We're doing it in order. She says, short runs, staggered, balance the heat. If you get a gap, you call it. You don't try to fill a canyon with pride. The woman's mouth twitches. Yes, ma'am. Don't call me that, Ev says, and hears Marisol's laugh in her head. Below them, a crane lowers a block into place with practiced precision. There's no ceremony now, no bunting, no sponsor. The block arrives, settles, gets wedged, gets tacked. A runner checks a box and sprints away. It's like watching a conveyor belt, except the belt is made of cranes and concrete and human bodies. Ev strikes her arc and the seam blooms white. Somewhere behind the noise, the yard's rhythm reveals itself. Fabrication shops feeding assembly areas feeding the ways feeding the fitting-out pier feeding the bay feeding the ocean. Each step timed, each step repeated. You can feel it if you stand still long enough. The yard isn't just building ships, it's building throughput. At break, Ev stands with Marisol beside a stack of hatch combings, eating a sandwich that tastes like cardboard and necessity. Marisol nods toward the far end of the yard, where a row of completed hulls sits at the outfitting pier, masts up like a forest of bare trees. They say we're turning out a ship every few days, Marisol says. Somebody in the office said the country's launching them like sausages. Ev chews slowly. The U-boats can't sink a ship that doesn't exist yet. Marisol snorts. Then we'd better keep making them exist. A whistle blows, break ends. The yard swallows them again. Later, as Ev walks the seam line checking the new kid's work, she sees the yard clock through a gap in the steel and realizes she has stopped hating it. Not because it's kind, because it isn't. Not because it's fair, because war isn't. But because the clock is honest. It doesn't pretend. It just marks the truth. Seconds passing, whether you're ready or not. Ev leans in over the kid's shoulder and taps the plate with her gloved knuckle. Slow down right there, she says. You're outrunning your puddle. He adjusts and the bead smooths out and Ev feels something that isn't pride exactly, but a grim satisfaction, like tightening a bolt on something that has to hold. Below, another block swings into place. Another hull number gets chalked onto steel. Another schedule board gets updated. And out beyond the fence, in a world Ev cannot see but can no longer pretend is distant, ships are still being hunted. Here, under floodlights and rain, the yard answers the hunt with repetition. Clean welds, measured sequences, and a relentless system that turns human exhaustion into floating tonnage. The second hand snaps forward. Ev lowers her hood and keeps the line moving. Human limits. July 22nd, 1943, Richmond, California. The heat hits the yard like a furnace door opening. Even at night, the steel holds the day's warmth. The decks sweat. The air above the plates shimmers under floodlights, and every breath tastes faintly of hot dust and salt. Ev steps onto the platform and feels the ship's skin radiating up through her boots, a slow, stubborn heat that makes the work feel heavier before she's even struck an arc. Below, the yard runs like it always runs now. Trucks growling, cranes clanking, whistles cutting through noise. But the pace has a new edge. Not faster, just tighter. Like the whole place is stretched to the last notch and everyone knows it. Ev checks her crew list on the clipboard, Frank shoved into her hands at the tool crib. Names, numbers, 2 new trainees, 1 transfer from another slip. A note in the margin in Frank's blunt handwriting, keep 'em safe. Safe, in a shipyard. She looks down at her gloved hands and tries not to laugh. Marisol climbs up beside her, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. You hear about slip 4? Ev doesn't look up. No. Guy got his sleeve caught on a grinder, Marisol says, voice careful. No flourish, no gore, just the fact. Tore him up bad. Ambulance came right onto the yard. Ev's jaw tightens. The war has made accidents feel like another kind of casualty list, quiet, local, and somehow harder to put into speeches. Is he? Alive? Marisol cuts in, quick. But he's done for a while. Ev nods once, and that nod feels like signing a paper you don't want to sign. A whistle blows. Their block is coming in. The crane carries the section over like a slow, heavy moon. Taglines tremble as men guide it. A fitter below raises a hand, fingers spread, signalling inch by inch. The block settles with a groan that sounds almost human. Ev watches the crew surge in. Wedges, hammers, tack welds flashing like small lightning strikes. She sees the new kid, Bakersfield, move too close to the suspended load, eyes fixed on the landing point like he thinks staring hard enough will make it behave. Ev's voice comes out sharp enough to cut steel. Back off the load. He jumps, startled, then retreats. 2 steps, then another, until he's clear. Marisol leans close. You're getting that foreman bark. Ev snorts. I don't want to bury anyone. They work the seam sequence the way the diagrams demand. Short runs, staggered, balanced. Ev moves from station to station like a conductor, checking fit-up, checking travel speed, listening to the weld sound. She can tell who's rushing by the way their bead looks. Too high, too hurried, like panic made visible. Halfway through the shift, a runner appears, breathless, carrying a message. Ev reads it under the floodlight glare. Overtime extended. No relief crew. She closes her eyes for 1 second, just one, and feels her body protest. The yard has been eating hours for so long that time outside the fence feels like a rumour. People talk about weekends the way sailors talk about shore leave. Down below, a man in a white shirt, office, not yard, walks through with a clipboard, stepping carefully around cables as if they might bite him. He looks up at the welders with the bright, hungry expression of someone counting output. Ev watches him and thinks. He sees ships. He doesn't see hands. Marisol follows her gaze. Production man, she mutters. They come down when the numbers are good. They vanish when the numbers hurt. Ev doesn't answer. She's thinking about the women at the gate in the morning, the ones who show up early to fight for a spot in the daycare line because if they miss it, they miss the shift. She's thinking about ration books. Sugar, gasoline, meat, little paper squares that make the home front feel like a ledger. She's thinking about the bus that drops workers off in waves, packed so tight people step out already tired. The yard doesn't just build ships, it consumes lives in manageable daily portions. Later, during a brief lull, if you can call 10 minutes a lull, Ev climbs down for water and passes a bulletin board by the canteen. Notices are pinned in overlapping layers. War bond drive results, safety reminders, missing time cards, new weld procedure updates, and tucked into a corner, a small flyer with block letters. Workers wanted, all shifts, no experience necessary. Ev stares at it until Marisol taps her elbow. Don't let it get under your skin. It already has, Ev says. The yard finds people the way a river finds water, pulling from everywhere. Farm girls, clerks, fishermen, teachers, men too old for the draft, boys too young to be comfortable, women who've never held a tool until the war hands them one and says, learn fast. Ev knows why. She knows the arithmetic Frank talked about back in 42. Sinkings, tonnage, the endless need. But knowing doesn't make it easier when she watches a trainee strike an arc too close to a fuel line tag and feels her heart jump like a startled animal. Near the end of shift, the heat breaks a little. A breeze sneaks in off the bay and carries the distant sound of a ship's horn. Ev pauses with her hood up, sweat drying cold on her forehead, and looks out across the outfitting pier. There, in the harsh light, a completed Liberty sits with its stern gun platform silhouetted against the water. Nearby, Navy men move like dark figures, checking mounts, lugging crates. Merchant crewmen in worn coats drift along the gangway with that particular posture, half shore, half sea, like they're already thinking in miles. Eve's throat tightens with a feeling she can't name. She built seams. She trained hands. She yelled kids away from loads. But the ship out there, floating, armed, assigned, belongs to a different world, a world where the yard clock can't help you. Frank appears beside her, lighting a cigarette with hands that shake just enough to notice. You did good tonight, he says. Ev watches the ship's silhouette. It doesn't feel like good. It feels like not enough. Frank exhales smoke toward the water. That's the war, he says. You never feel caught up. You just keep moving. Above the ways, the clock snaps forward again, indifferent as ever. Ev lowers her hood, sets a fresh rod and goes back to the seam, back to the only part of the war she can touch, one weld at a time. Cargo that wins battles. November 26, 1943, Richmond, California. Thanksgiving on the home front doesn't arrive with turkey so much as it arrives with a different kind of noise. The yard is still running, of course it is, but the canteen smells briefly, impossibly, like real food. Someone has found a way to stretch gravy across 1,000 trays. Someone else has pinned a paper cornucopia to the bulletin board beside the safety notices and weld diagrams, as if construction paper can make the war feel less like a factory schedule. Ev finishes her shift with slag dust in her hair and a deep ache in her elbows that feels older than 23. When she steps down from the platform, her legs wobble like she's been out at sea. Marisol catches her elbow. "Don't fall on me," Marisol says, but her voice is soft. "I got plans to eat." Ev follows her toward the canteen, boots clacking on wet planks. The bay wind is sharper tonight, cold enough to make the metal sing when you touch it. Across the fence line, Richmond's lights look dimmer than they used to. Blackout habits, wartime caution. Inside the canteen, the din is different from the yard's roar. It's human. Forks scraping. People laughing too loud because they're tired. A radio in the corner plays something cheerful that no one really listens to. Ev and Marisol grab trays and find a place at the end of a long table. Ev takes one bite and realizes she's hungrier than she thought. Hunger is a yard constant, like noise, like clock ticks, something you carry without noticing until it's too heavy. Then Ev sees the man. He sits alone near the far wall, shoulders hunched over a cup of coffee like he's warming his hands on it. He isn't Navy, no crisp uniform. He isn't yard, no coveralls. He wears a worn peacoat with salt stains at the cuffs, and his cap is pushed back like he forgot it was there. His face has that wind-burned look Ev has seen on fishermen down by the Oakland docks, skin toughened by weather and long hours, eyes that don't flinch when a door slams. A merchant mariner. Ev feels it before she names it. The yard builds the ships, but the people who take them out are ghosts to most workers, heard about, not seen. A rumour in a newspaper, a name on a missing list. Marisol follows Eve's gaze and lowers her voice. "He came in with the morning tug crew," she murmurs. "Somebody said he's picking up a new hull, says he's sailed Liberty before." Eve's throat tightens. "Alone?" Marisol shrugs. "Maybe he likes quiet." Ev finds herself standing before she's decided to. Her tray feels heavy in her hands. She walks toward the man, aware of every step, aware that she doesn't know the rules of talking to someone who lives in the part of the war she can't touch. When she reaches his table, he looks up. His eyes are clear, tired, and surprisingly young. 30, maybe. 30 with too many miles on him. "Evening," Ev says, and then, because she can't stop herself, "You're merchant marine." The man's mouth twitches, almost a smile. "Guilty." Ev gestures awkwardly at the empty chair. "Mind if!" "Go ahead," he says. His voice has the rasp of someone who's spent too much time in wind and engine smoke. Ev sits. For a moment, neither of them speaks. The canteen noise swells around them, then recedes like surf. Finally, the man nods toward her hands. Even scrubbed, they carry the yard, burn marks ground in darkness at the knuckles. "You build 'em?" he asks. Ev glances down at her own fingers. "Weld. Lead crew now." He exhales, slow, like he's been carrying a weight he didn't know how to set down. "Then I owe you." Ev blinks. "You don't owe me anything." He shakes his head. "You do something long enough, you learn what keeps you alive. On a Liberty, you learn to trust seams you never see. You learn to trust the people who laid 'em." Ev's chest warms in a way the coffee never could. "Where have you been?" she asks, and hears how hungry the question is. He looks past her for a second, past the canteen, past the yard, past the bay, like the answer lives somewhere far away and cold. "North Atlantic," he says. "Convoys. Murk so thick you couldn't tell sky from sea. We'd run blacked out, no smoking on deck. Even a match was like waving at death." Eve's jaw tightens. She thinks of the armed guard kids she saw march past the slipways. "You had Navy gun crew?" "Yeah," he says. "Stern gun. A couple up forward on some runs. Boys barely old enough to shave. They'd drill on that deck like it was a parade ground. You'd hear the gun captain barking ranges into the wind like he could scare the ocean into behaving. Marisol's voice is a low murmur from behind Ev's shoulder. She has drifted closer without sitting, pretending to be casual, failing. "Did you see them?" she asks. "The submarines?" The mariner pauses. His hand tightens around the cup. "Sometimes you saw a wake," he says, careful. "Sometimes you saw nothing, and then you heard the alarms. The escorts would run out, throw patterns, and you'd just keep station, because if you break formation, you're alone." Ev swallows. No gore, no details, just the shape of fear. He sets the cup down gently as if noise matters. "But I'll tell you something," he says, leaning in. "The thing that changed out there wasn't courage. We always had that, or we didn't. The thing that changed was..." He taps the table once with a finger. "Just ships kept coming." Eve watches him, not blinking. "In 42 it felt like the ocean was eating us faster than we could feed it," he says. "Then we started hearing names in the ports, seeing new hulls, fresh paint, same design, over and over. You'd sail one out and another would be waiting behind it like a brother. If one didn't make it..." He stops, breathes, and chooses the next words like they're hot. "The cargo still got there because the line didn't stop." Ev feels the yard clock in her head ticking without mercy. "You ever know what you're carrying?" she asks. He smiles then, a real one, tired but honest. "Sometimes. Sometimes it was crates marked in code. Sometimes it was trucks. Sometimes it was food that made the dock workers in Liverpool cheer like you'd brought them gold. Once we hauled prefab bridge sections, steel that turned into a road the next week." Eve's mind flashes to the fabrication yard, panels like quilts, blocks like buildings. "Like a bridge," she murmurs. "Exactly like a bridge," the mariner says, and for a moment his eyes brighten. "You folks aren't building ships for beauty. You're building moving roads. You're building time, and time is what wins a war." Outside, through the canteen window, Ev can see the yard lights reflected on the wet ground. Cranes move in the distance, slow and tireless. Another hull is taking shape even on Thanksgiving, even in cold, even in fatigue. The mariner stands, shrugging into his pea coat. "I'm shipping out again," he says. "New Liberty. Outfitting pier. She's not finished yet, but she'll float." Ev rises too, as if pulled by a tide. "What's her name?" she asks. He hesitates, then gives it to her, one of those names drawn from history, painted in white on grey steel, meant to remind you what you're fighting for. Ev repeats it under her breath like it's a weld line she needs to remember. He holds out his hand. Ev grips it, glove to callus, and feels the strange loop close, yard to ocean, steel to miles. "Keep 'em coming," he says. Ev looks past him, past the canteen, toward the ways where the clock keeps snapping forward in the dark. "We will," she answers, and knows she means it. Outside, the bay wind rises, and somewhere a tugboat horn sounds like a promise being answered. When Europe calls. June 6, 1944, Richmond, California. The news comes in before the sun does. It slips into the shipyard on a thin ribbon of radio static, carried by a set in the tool crib where men usually listen for baseball scores that don't exist anymore. Someone has turned the volume up until the speaker rattles. A dozen workers stand in a half circle, hard hats tipped back, coffee cups forgotten in their hands. Landings. Normandy. Allied troops have begun. The words land like a hammer blow and then keep coming, too fast to catch cleanly. Names tumble out, beaches, towns, the English Channel, places Ev has never seen, places she suddenly feels she knows because she has been building toward them without being told. Marisol appears at Ev's shoulder, breath smelling of coffee and fatigue. "It's happening," she whispers, as if saying it louder might jinx it. Ev looks at the faces around the radio. Some are smiling in disbelief, some are pale, some just stare, jaws tight, because the war has trained them not to celebrate until the cost shows up. Frank elbows in from the back, cigarette unlit between his fingers. He listens for a full minute, then says the only thing he can say in a place like this. "All right, you heard. Now move." And the shipyard moves. On the ways, a Liberty hull waits in half-finished silence, ribs and plates catching the early light like dull armor. A crane swings overhead with a load already in motion, because the yard doesn't pause for history. History pauses for the yard. Ev climbs to her platform with her lead crew behind her, the sea wind sharp against her cheeks. Her hands find the familiar world: stinger, ground clamp, electrode rod. The seam ahead is marked in chalk, match lines telling steel how to become one thing instead of two. Somewhere beyond the fence, the newspapers will call today a turning point. In the yard, it becomes a different word: demand. By mid-morning, the bulletin board outside the canteen has a fresh sheet pinned to it, official and blunt: all production schedules maintained. No slowdown. Someone has underlined it twice with a grease pencil. Ev watches a runner sprint past with a message for another slipway. She watches a truck back up with a pallet of electrodes. She watches a line of new hires, faces uncertain, clothes still too clean, being herded toward the training shack. The yard is bracing, not cheering. Marisol is the one who says what everyone is thinking. "They're going to need everything," she mutters, stepping around a coil of cable. "Fuel, ammo, food, trucks, bandages. All of it." Eve lowers her hood. The arc flares white and fierce, and in that instant the roar of the yard feels linked to the roar of distant surf hitting French sand. She welds through the morning, checks the kid's bead, corrects the angle of the older woman's rod, keeps the sequence balanced so the steel doesn't pull. It's work she knows how to do. It's work she can control. But the radio keeps finding her anyway. At lunch, it's on in the canteen, wedged between patriotic songs and announcements about ration stamps. Reporters' voices sound strange, excited, strained, as if they're trying to narrate something too big for language. Ev catches phrases: heavy resistance, beachheads, airborne. She sees hands tighten around forks. She sees Marisol stare at her tray like she can't remember how to eat. Frank sits across from Ev, unusually quiet. He stirs coffee with a spoon he never lifts to his mouth. "You got anyone over there?" Ev asks finally. Frank's eyes flick up, then away. "Nephew," he says. "Army. Doesn't write much." Ev nods. She doesn't ask more. In this yard, everyone learns which questions bring pain. That evening, Ev walks past the outfitting pier and sees a Liberty riding at the dock with cargo already staged nearby. Crates and barrels under tarps, trucks lined up like obedient animals. Navy armed guard sailors move on deck, checking mounts, practicing drills with the stiff repetition of men who've learned that repetition is what keeps fear from eating you alive. One of the sailors looks up as Ev passes. Not the farm boy from 42, older now, harder, or maybe simply a different face that carries the same wartime youth. He nods once and Ev nods back, an exchange without words. We're both doing what we can. A tugboat horn sounds. Mooring lines slacken and then go taut. The ship inches away from the pier as if reluctant to leave the only safe place it knows. Ev stops and watches. The Liberty turns its bow toward the open water, toward the Golden Gate, toward the ocean that swallows ships and also delivers them. For a moment, Ev can imagine the line that runs from this dock to Normandy. Grey water, grey sky, grey steel, and 1,000 miles of risk in between. Marisol comes up beside her, hands in her pockets. "Think it makes a difference?" she asks softly. Ev remembers the merchant mariner's words: moving roads, building time. She watches the Liberty's stern slide past the pier, the wake forming behind it like a signature. "It has to," Ev says. "If it doesn't, then what are we doing?" The ship's horn sounds again. Deep, steady, and then it's moving out into the bay, tugboats flanking it like guard dogs. Above the ways, the clock snaps forward. Ev turns back toward the slipway where another hull is waiting, another set of seams marked and ready. In France, men are climbing out of landing craft into gunfire. Here, under floodlights and cranes, Ev climbs back into her hood and strikes an arc. And the yard answers Europe with steel. Continue. Section 10. 1945. The day the clock stops. May 8, 1945. Richmond, California. The news hits the shipyard like sunlight after a long storm, sudden, disorienting, almost painful in its brightness. Ev hears it first as shouting, real shouting, not foreman yelling, not warning whistles. Cheers, laughter. People running, not because a crane load is swinging wrong, but because for once the running is joy. Someone has a radio hoisted high over their head near the gate. The announcer's voice cracks with excitement. Germany has surrendered, victory in Europe. For a few seconds, the yard forgets its own rules. Men climb onto stacks of timber and wave their caps. Women hug strangers. A siren wails, but not the emergency wail. This one is long and triumphant. the kind you want the whole bay to hear. Ev stands still in the churn of bodies, hands hanging at her sides like she doesn't know what to do with them without a stinger or a chipping hammer. Her heart is thudding so hard it makes her dizzy. Marisol slams into her from the side and wraps her in a fierce, squeezing hug. "We did it," Marisol says into Eve's shoulder. "We did it. We did it." Ev laughs, once sharp and surprised, and then she's crying without realizing it, tears cutting clean lines down cheeks dusted with soot. Frank appears, pushing through the crowd with his cigarette still behind his ear, like habit refuses to surrender. His eyes are red, and for the first time Ev has known him, he looks unguarded. "You hear?" he says, and his voice cracks on the word like it has been waiting years to crack. "Europe's done." Ev nods, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Your nephew?" Frank swallows. "Alive," he says. He doesn't say more because alive is enough to fill a room. The cheering rolls on. And then, because this is a shipyard and habit is heavier than joy, people begin to look around as if expecting an order. A schedule. A whistle telling them what comes next. The war in the Pacific is still raging. Everyone knows it. The radios remind them between songs. The yard cannot simply stop. Not yet. And so the celebration folds back into motion, not as hard as before, but still forward. Ev returns to her slipway, returns to the seam lines, returns to the strange comfort of doing something with her hands that makes sense. Months pass in a blur of launches and lists, of ships still going out with grey paint and grim purpose. The pace eases in places, then tightens again when casualty reports arrive from far oceans. Ev loses track of how many hulls she has touched. She measures time by the smell of flux and the way her shoulders feel at the end of a shift. Then, August 15th, 1945, Richmond, California. It's morning this time, bright and warm, the bay sparkling like it doesn't understand war. The sirens start again, and this time there's no question what they mean. Radios everywhere blare the same words, again and again, like the nation is afraid the sound will vanish if it doesn't repeat it. Japan has accepted surrender terms. The war is over. Ev is on a platform halfway up a Liberty's side when she hears it. She freezes with the stinger in her hand, hood lifted, face turned toward the sound as if the announcement is a physical thing she can see. Below, a man drops his wrench. It clatters on steel and rings like a bell. Marisol climbs up, eyes shining. "Ev," she says, breathless, like she ran here from another life. It's done. Ev tries to speak and can't. Her throat is tight with all the days she didn't stop, all the nights she welded through rain and heat and fear, all the faces she saw march towards ships that would carry them into darkness. Frank appears at the base of the platform, looking up. He doesn't shout, he doesn't bark. He simply raises one hand, palm out. Stop. It takes a moment for the yard to understand. The machines don't stop immediately. Cranes still swing on inertia, trucks still idle, the great organism still breathing because it doesn't know how to do anything else. But gradually, like a tide turning, the noise thins. The first arc lights go dark. A grinder winds down into silence. A hammer stops mid-swing. Ev stands there in the sudden quiet and realizes she can hear the bay, actual water, actual wind, sounds the shipyard has been drowning out for years. She climbs down slowly, as if she's afraid the ground will change under her feet. Workers gather along the slipway, looking at one another with expressions that don't fit their faces, relief, disbelief, emptiness, laughter, all tangled together. Someone starts singing. Not well. Not in tune. But it spreads anyway, voices joining because for once nobody cares how it sounds. Ev walks toward the yard clock without thinking. She has hated it, respected it, obeyed it, used it as a compass. It looms over the ways the same as always, numbers big as commandments, hands poised to keep snapping forward. But now the second hand is still moving because time doesn't sign surrender. Yet the clock feels different. It no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a witness. Frank stands beneath it, looking up the way he used to look up only when he was afraid the schedule was slipping. His cigarette is still unlit. His hands hang loose at his sides, as if he's forgotten what they're for when they aren't pushing people. Ev joins him. Marisol joins them too, shoulder to shoulder. All around the yard is full of workers who don't know where to put their momentum. "Think they'll tear it down?" Marisol asks, nodding at the clock. Frank exhales something like a laugh without sound. "They can try," he says, but it did its job. Ev looks past the clock to the slipway, where a half-finished hull sits quiet, ribs open to the sky. For years that sight would have been unbearable, evidence of delay, of falling behind. Now it's simply unfinished, like a sentence you don't have to force to the end. Out on the bay, a Liberty ship moves under tow, grey hull cutting through glittering water. Not racing now, just going. The war's urgency has drained away, leaving the ships as what they always were beneath the propaganda and the panic. Carriers, bridges, moving roads. Ev thinks of the merchant mariner in the canteen, his salt-stained cuffs, his tired smile. She thinks of the sailors marching with duffels, of Frank's nephew alive somewhere, of the people whose names never made it back. She thinks of all the seams she laid and all the seams she didn't, and how the world will keep needing things moved even when it stops needing them moved under fire. Marisol nudges her gently. "You okay?" Ev listens to the quiet again, the rarest sound she has ever heard in this place. She feels the ache in her shoulders like an old companion. She feels, for the first time in years, the possibility of a day that isn't measured by a shift bell. "I don't know," Ev admits. Then she looks up at the clock one more time, not with anger, not with fear, with the strange tenderness you can feel for something that almost broke you and also kept you going. "But I think," she says, voice steady, "I'm going to learn." Frank nods once, as if that's the only sensible plan anyone's said in a long time. Around them, the yard begins to empty, not in panic, not in exhaustion, but in a slow, careful flow of people walking out as if they're leaving a battlefield after the last shot, unsure what to do with their hands now that they don't have to keep building tomorrow. The cranes stand still against the sky. The ways are quiet. And for the first time since 1942, the shipyard's rhythm belongs to peacetime, uneven, uncertain, but real.